Imagine being trapped almost half a mile underground, in complete darkness, unsure if anyone even knows you're alive. This is the true story of 33 Chilean miners who, against all odds, survived 69 days trapped in a collapsed mine. It was an ordinary workday at the San José Mine, a copper and gold mine in the Atacama Desert in northern Chile. This mine was one of the oldest in the country, and the men working there were experienced miners. They knew mining was dangerous work. It was hot, dusty, and risky, but these miners were used to it. Many of them had been working in mines for years to support their families, used to facing tough conditions underground. As they went about their day, 33 men worked in shifts, going deeper and deeper into the mine. They were over 2,000 feet below the ground, about the height of 2 Empire State Buildings stacked on top of each other. Suddenly, the ground around them started to rumble. A strange noise echoed through the tunnels as the ground shook beneath their feet. Before anyone could react, a massive section of rock collapsed behind them, blocking the exit. In a few terrifying moments, the miners found themselves trapped deep underground, with tons of rock and rubble blocking any way out. Panic set in immediately. Some miners tried to run back to the main entrance, hoping to find a path, but the tunnel was completely sealed off. They quickly realized that there was no escape. They were completely trapped. Their communication lines were cut, and there was no way to call for help. The miners were now in a dark, small space with limited light, food, and water. They didn't know if anyone above ground even knew what had happened to them. In the hours that followed, the miners gathered together, doing their best to keep calm. They had to think of a way to survive in these unimaginable conditions. Some had only the clothes on their backs, and everyone knew that they'd need to work together if they were going to have any chance of staying alive. But none of them knew how long it would take, or if they'd ever see their families again. After the dust settled, the miners took a look around to understand their situation. They were deep in the earth, far below the surface, and there was no way to escape. With no light from the sun, it was pitch dark except for the faint light from their headlamps. The air was heavy, the temperature was hot and humid, and everything around them was eerily silent. Their first thoughts were about how to survive, and whether anyone on the surface would find them in time. But survival in such a situation was going to be extremely difficult. The men only had a small, dimly lit area where they could gather. This place, known as the refuge, was designed as an emergency shelter, but it was small and only stocked with very limited supplies. They soon realized they had a difficult road ahead. As they took stock of their supplies, they found just a few cans of tuna, some biscuits, a bit of milk, and some water. Enough to last even 2 days for 33 men. So, they made the decision to ration what they had. Each man would only get 1 spoonful of food and a tiny sip of water each day. They would have to make these small amounts last, as they didn't know how long it would take to be rescued or if they would be rescued at all. The group quickly organized themselves, with some men taking charge of handing out the food and water. They set up a daily schedule and agreed on strict rules to make sure they used every resource wisely. Their teamwork was crucial. Each man took turns keeping an eye out for signs of rescue, while others shared stories or even sang songs to keep everyone's spirits up. These activities helped distract them from hunger and fear. Though conditions were harsh, they found strength by sticking together. Days turned into weeks, and still, they were trapped in the dark. The stress was overwhelming, and some began to wonder if they'd ever make it out. But even in the darkest moments, the men held on to a small, shared sense of hope. They had to believe that someone, somewhere was working to find them. By now, the miners had been trapped underground for more than 2 long weeks. Their situation was becoming desperate. They had managed to survive with barely any food and only small sips of water. Each man was weaker than before, and the mood was tense, but they never gave up hope. Above ground, their families were waiting anxiously, hoping and praying for a miracle. Meanwhile, Rescuers were working around the clock, trying to locate exactly where the miners were in the maze-like tunnels of the San José Mine. Engineers and experts from all over the world had joined the rescue effort, trying to find a way to make contact with the trapped men. Using a drilling machine, they decided to create a small hole that could reach down to the area where they thought the miners might be. The drill would have to go down more than 2,000 feet through solid rock, so it was a challenging task, but the rescuers were determined. Finally, after days of drilling, the rescuers broke through into a section of the mine near the refuge where the miners were waiting, but no one knew if the miners would even see the small drill hole or if they were close enough to the area. When the rescuers pulled the drill bit back up, they couldn't believe what they found. Attached to the drill was a small piece of paper, a note written by the miners. The note read, "We are well in the shelter, all 33 of us. Every single miner was alive." The rescuers lowered a small camera down the hole to communicate with the miners. They could finally see the men on the screen, thin but alive, and it was a moment of pure happiness for everyone involved. They talked to the miners, who described their conditions and how they had managed to survive so far. Though they were exhausted and hungry, the men were grateful to know that they had not been forgotten. After weeks of planning and waiting, October 13th, 2010 finally arrived. The rescue team had worked day and night to prepare everything, and now it was time to bring the miners back to the surface. The miners had been trapped underground for 69 days, over 2 months, but now they were about to be freed. To bring the miners up, the engineers had built a special capsule called the Phoenix. The Phoenix was designed to carry one person at a time, pulling each miner up from the dark depths of the mine to the bright world above. It was a narrow metal tube, just big enough for a person to stand in. It had small windows and an oxygen supply to help the miners breathe during the journey to the surface. The first miner chosen to go up was Florencio Avalos. He was nervous but determined as he stepped into the Phoenix capsule. The rescuers secured him in and gave him a final check. Then, they began to slowly pull the capsule up the narrow escape shaft, and everyone on the surface watched anxiously, hoping that nothing would go wrong. The rescue operation lasted over 24 hours. Through the day and into the night, the Phoenix went down and came back up, bringing one miner after another. Finally, when the last miner, Luis Urzua, emerged, the world breathed a sigh of relief. Every single miner had been saved. The rescuers, the miners, their families, and people around the world were overjoyed. This was a true miracle, a moment of hope and triumph.